Welcome back, radio entrepreneurs, listeners, and fans. I'm producer Nathan Gobes, and I'm excited to introduce you all to part 2 of the 6th Family Business FBA panel discussion, The Great Economic Reset. In this family business related summer 2022 edition of the panel discussion, we'll be covering topics related to creating organizational stability during economic instability, strategies for leading a family business through inflation and supply chain issues, planning for a recession, and much more. If you have not yet seen part 1 of this panel discussion, we recommend you head over to radioentrepreneurs.com or any of our many channels to catch the first segment that we've already released. All of these discussions are intended to be highly relevant to family businesses, but also entrepreneurs of all types. So please follow and subscribe to Radio Entrepreneurs. Next, I'll introduce our 3 panelists and hosts for this discussion. For their full introductions, please refer back to episode 1, which is linked in the description below. We are joined today by Stephen Wilchins of Wilchins, Cosentino, and Novins, Rich Hirschens of Gray, Gray, and David Santos of the Northern Trust Corporation. Welcome, everyone. And of course, Jeffrey Davis, our host for Radio Entrepreneurs and founder, CEO of Mage LLC. Welcome, Jeffrey. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to this segment on the thought leadership and the Great Reset. This section of our presentation is on leadership actions today. Let's be a little bit optimistic. Following up on the last session and their comments about Ukraine, let's assume that the war at the Ukraine is going to end. How quickly do you think things will start to stabilize in terms of global markets, food, energy, inflation? Do you think that will have an effect on it? And can we make any forecasts with that at all?
You're saying the war ending and sanctions against Russia, both ending?
Well, I didn't put the sanctions out. The sanctions, you never know how long those could take, but you're right. That is a factor. Thank you, Rich. That could go on for a while. And clearly we're feeling sanctions. There is definitely retaliatory behavior. We're all feeling it here in a different way.
Yeah, my comments around that would be that the moment there is a ceasefire or an end to the war that's announced, I think you would see immediate transmission to prices of commodities react. We see it all the time with energy these days. And we would see it obviously in the energy sector as well. You would see prices react in a downward fashion, as just the expectation that the bottlenecks around getting grain out of the Ukraine are going to ease. Then the question would be, what does it look like? What does the recovery look like? We mentioned sanctions, and obviously there would probably be a lot of negotiations around that and give and take, but immediately positive price action, and then a view on when those supplies are likely to get back to the market is the other key point, which probably obviously would take longer, be more drawn out, but it'd be a wait and see situation.
Yeah, I think you'd see commodity prices probably drop. I think it may take longer for the prices that consumers are paying to really go down. But they say they go up like a rocket and down like a feather, something like that. So I think it would take some time after the war ends before consumers are really seeing the benefit.
Steve, I see you moving. Does that mean you want to say something?
No.
I think it's important. I think it's important also to note, because we've seen we've seen commodity prices start to abate over the last couple of weeks. And I think most people believe that's because the growth outlook, both in the US and globally, have started to come down. The World Bank, the IMF have dropped growth estimates for global growth. In the US now, Northern Trust, we just recently downgraded our growth expectations for the US. So as growth starts to come down, then the question is, when does the war end? Does it end, in 2 weeks or 2 years? And I think if we look out over the next 12 months, I think there's a pretty consensus expectation that growth is going to be much slower. That'll take pressure off of commodity prices in and of itself. We're already starting to see that. And then I think, the end of the Ukrainian Russian war would be an accelerant in that price decline dynamic as we look out.
But I think at that point, we're in a recession.
And that'll also affect the housing market.
Right.
Absolutely. Already
So-
seeing housing action starting to unwind a bit. New home sales, mortgage applications, refis are effectively completely dried up, and beginning to see some slowdown in pricing momentum in the real estate market as well. So that's all likely to play out.
What was interesting is reading the Wall Street Journal, I think yesterday, talking about rentals, how they continue to increase. And in fact, it's like a bidding war to secure a rental property. I don't think I know we've experienced increases, but I don't think we have a bidding war in this part of the country. I'm sure in other parts, there is bidding wars for rentals. Because a lot of people are not buying homes, they're selling their homes and not reinvesting. So,
that's going to continue to be a problem. I think if we think about mortgage rates having doubled in 2 or 3 months' time, what that effectively have done is shut out many millions of people out of the real estate market because they can't afford it anymore. And what are they going to do? They're going to continue to rent. So the rental market, I think, is going to be one area that's going to continue to be noteworthy in the inflationary picture, because rents aren't likely to decelerate anytime soon, I would think.
So you're recommending REITs?
Well, yeah, depending what their exposure is, yeah, for sure. Apartment rates, yeah.
And if we're going to assume these other factors that you mentioned, if this ends up being a longer inflationary period, how do you think that could potentially affect things?
Well, the longer inflation runs hot, the more the Fed is going to push the interest rate curve higher, right? And I think that's going to lead to even slower economic growth, which flows back to companies, right? In terms of earnings expectations, demand expectations. Steve had mentioned the number of layoffs we're beginning to see, and that's the first lever that a management will pull when they're in an environment where their demand forecast starts to decline. So I think the longer inflation stays elevated, the harder the Fed is going to have to push. And this is happening across the globe. This morning, there was a panel on Bloomberg with the head of the central banks of England, the ECB, the US, and they're all moving in the same direction, all tightening at a very aggressive pace. And the further they have to go, the more economic damage is going to be done. Right.
I've been hearing a lot in the news about 40 years ago, and I was around in the early 1980s, sad to say, and I watched what happened and how it affected the economy. And I'm just thinking that if all these things do continue, we're going to be looking at a different economy, but also it's going to be harder for businesses to borrow money. And I think virtually all of our clients have been in the habit for years of borrowing money at a low interest rate. And I'm wondering how you see that as well.
Well, I think there was actually news this morning. I don't know if anybody saw it, but Carnival Cruise Lines was downgraded by an analyst, and one of the points that the analyst made was that there's a possibility that Carnival would get shut out of the high yield bond market, and basically the assumption being that their availability of credit would dry up. The stock's down, I think, 15% this morning on the news, and I think that's the real risk here. And I think what you'll hear strategists talk about as the Fed pushes further and further on rates is that typically when you get into this type of a tightening cycle, something breaks, meaning there's you look back in time, there have been crises that erupt during a tightening cycle. If you look at long-term credit, the hedge fund that went belly up, you look at other instances, going back to Continental Bank as an example, when it imploded, that when you have this hard a reset in policy, there are certain certainly there's a situation where the risk of something a more full-blown financial crisis arises, and I think we'll clearly be looking for that. It's hard to predict, but this is typically when that happens, and it usually relates to credit availability or the expense of credit rising as rapidly as it is.
Bringing it down to closely held family businesses, I think business owners are skittish about continuing to expand. I think that's the sentiment, the confidence in the economy is waning, so they're concerned, so they're pulling back. So not only are they pulling back on employment, but they're pulling back on expansion or new opportunities for the most part. So that's going to have an impact with a number of businesses in this area.
I agree with Steve, and talking to clients, you're seeing that as well, that there's some concerns, and they're thinking twice about things that maybe a couple of years ago they wouldn't. It's one, the availability of capital is maybe tougher, and certainly it's more costly to get that money.
I'm a conservative management consultant trained by my father, and I'm a big fan of minimal bank debt and lots of cash reserves, because I think the companies with cash will do well in this economy, because as things are unstable and companies will not be making moves, it leaves an opportunity to those companies that can make the moves. And I think that's been the history throughout time. So I would encourage people to have strong balance sheets right now, which is what my friend Rich Hirschens is very good at predicting and working with people to do. So I'm just going to change the subject a little bit, because with all this stuff going on, employees leaving for higher salaries, inflation, maybe it's going to be harder to keep jobs as companies start to lay off people. So the pendulum may swing. What's really been hard with all of this has been able to maintain culture. And, all studies have always shown culture beats strategy 7-1. Culture beats financing. Culture beats being in the right category. How do entrepreneurs keep their culture strong with all this instability going on?
I think it's the same things they did before the pandemic. How do you have culture? To me, it just comes down to the people you're working with and the relationships at the company. And that sort of creates your culture. I think working remotely has taken a lot of that away, where you don't see everyone all the time. If you have people that started at the company after the pandemic and maybe have never been in person, they don't really get to know people. So the relationships that when you think of some of your coworkers you've developed over years just aren't there. And then it becomes, so what's keeping me at the company? Is it just the salary? Because that's a tough battle to win. The work, I don't think any of us are doing anything so unique that the work itself can keep you there. I think it's the people you're working with and your enjoyment of going to the office. So, we're seeing that, trying to get people back to the office, and people like the convenience of working remotely, but people are starting to see it, kind of miss, making friends at work and having that camaraderie.
I think part of what businesses are being forced to do is become a little more flexible on culture, in the sense of dealing with rules with regards to whether it's remote, whether it's, coming in halftime, things like that, allowing the employees to have a little more say also in what they want to do, provided there are clear expectations that the company meets their goals, but at the same time, give more flexibility to employees. The other issue is rebuilding connection. I think companies to get that culture, it's hard because there's so many people that are remote. So how do you rebuild that culture and rebuild the connection of all the employees? And that's going to be a challenge for a number of companies to have that and succeed in doing that well. I think we all struggle with that with our employees.
Yeah, and I would add, especially the when you have new employees or more junior employees who, you want to train them and get them imbued in the culture out of the gate, and that's, I think, been a particular challenge over the last couple of years and likely to be ongoing as we stay in some form of a hybrid model system.
Well, I've noticed through COVID and now specifically during this hard time, a lot of my clients are investing more in culture than ever before. They want to make sure that people know that business is more than just business, that it's a community, and that they need to stick and work together, and that they need to make those investments. And the companies that are doing that, it seems to be paying some dividends. And my last question in this segment really has to do with the midterm elections. Again, today, we're coming upon these midterm elections. How do entrepreneurs prepare for what's coming? Because again, it's more instability.
Yeah, I would say that clearly as we head into the midterms, there's a consensus that that the incumbent party is likely to face a lot of challenges in this election, and then that will certainly impact policy decisions that arise after the election, and that it's hard to plan for that, but I think the likely outcome is that we're not going to see any radical change to taxation policy most likely, which makes things a little more easier to plan for, and I think that's kind of the viewpoint that we're taking heading into them.
Okay, I'm going to call our producer back on and let him close out this segment. And I appreciate all the content and feedback that we received. Nathan Gobes, the producer of Radio Entrepreneurs.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. Another really interesting conversation, some important discussions for business owners to consider. That wraps up part 2 of this summer 2022 edition of the FBA Family Business Panel discussion. We want to thank all our listeners and viewers who've tuned in to this segment on Radio Entrepreneurs. Links will be provided in the description below to part 1 if you didn't catch it already, and part 3 once it comes out. Be sure to also like, comment, share, subscribe, and press that bell button if you're fans of Radio Entrepreneurs. It helps us immensely. And of course, we're also highly active on LinkedIn, so you can go and follow us there for more discussion and content. Until next time, goodbye and thanks for listening. We'll be back with more on Radio Entrepreneurs.